Elliot Engel chairs this 3-hour with freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar humanitarian crisis in Venezuela with witnesses from the State Department, including the U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela. His testimony included an exchange with freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who questioned him about his role in the Iran-Contra affair. New York Congressman Elliot Engel chairs this 3-hour hearing.
Committee will come to order.
As the situation in Venezuela continues to unfold, it's important that the Foreign Affairs Committee hear from policymakers in the Trump administration on the latest developments and how the United States will continue to engage on this issue. So I'm glad to welcome our panel, whom I'll introduce prior to their statements. And let me also welcome all our members, the public, and the press. And we're glad to have our friends from C-SPAN here this morning to cover our hearing. Before we start, without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Let me start by saying that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is simply heartbreaking. 90% of Venezuelans are living in poverty. More than 1 in 10 children suffers from malnutrition, and nearly 10% of the country's population of 31 million has fled overseas. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that this crisis is entirely man-made. Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest and most prosperous countries in the hemisphere it once was. But the corruption, incompetence, and mismanagement of Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him have driven that country off the edge of a cliff. The blame lies squarely with the crooked officials who have repressed the Venezuelan people for years, doing everything from throwing political opponents in jail, to rigging elections, to gunning down protesters in the street. Now, some consider it a good soundbite to say that Venezuela represents the failure of socialism. But we should be honest that Venezuela is not a socialist country. It's a kleptocracy. It's a cruel and oppressive regime, pocketing every dollar it can, even if it means that the country's people are literally starving to death. Nowhere is Nicolas Maduro's disregard for his fellow Venezuelans clearer than his decision to block humanitarian aid from entering the country last week at the Colombia-Venezuela border. This was a disgrace, and we need to keep looking for ways to get this assistance to those who need it without provoking a confrontation that could lead to the loss of life. The Venezuelan people deserve better. They deserve the future they choose for themselves and their country. So our question is, how do we help them attain that future? How do we stand with the people of Venezuela as they seek a peaceful, democratic transition? First, governments around the world, and especially here in our neighborhood, need to support the Venezuelan National Assembly and Juan Guaido as they work toward free and fair elections, elections that must be monitored by credible international observers, including the OAS, the Organization of American States. The EU Latin America Contact Group can play a potentially crucial role in laying the groundwork for these elections, an area where our own administration can provide financial and political support. What about U.S. policy more broadly? I will credit the administration. In the last few weeks, we've seen good multilateral engagement to grapple with this crisis. I'm glad the White House rejects Nicolas Maduro. I think we should reject authoritarians regardless of their ideology, and that would include despots like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. But I do worry about the president's saber-rattling, his hints that the U.S. military intervention remains an option. I want to make clear to our witnesses and to everyone else watching, U.S. military intervention is not an option. Congress decides when, where, and how the U.S. military is used around the world, and Congress would not support military intervention in Venezuela. Venezuela's neighbors feel the same way. Just last week, Colombia's deputy foreign minister said that, and I quote him, "In no way would the Colombian government permit or agree with any type of military intervention," unquote, in Venezuela. With respect to new sanctions on the PDVSA, I appreciate the need to squeeze Maduro, but the White House must think through the potential repercussions if these sanctions could have on the Venezuelan people if Maduro does not leave office in the coming weeks. We need to continually evaluate their effectiveness. My biggest concern about the administration's policy is what appears to be missing. What are we going to do about the more than 3 million Venezuelans who have already left the country? This has become Latin America's biggest migration crisis in recent history, and I fear the United States may make things worse. For starters, we should be taking in more Venezuelan refugees, but our admission numbers are at their lowest in recent history. Worse, the immigration policies of the White House have resulted in more Venezuelans being deported back to Venezuela and that's like sending people back into a burning building. The president could fix that with the stroke of a pen. He could grant temporary protected status, or TPS, to Venezuelans living in the United States. I hope he does so. And I've also co-sponsored a bill written by Representative Soto that would take this step. There's more we can do legislatively. Mr. McCall and I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to draft a bipartisan resolution on this matter. We were about 95% of the way there, but hit a roadblock similar to the Senate on how to deal with questions about the use of force in Venezuela. This is a policy difference, and it's a debate worth having, including during this hearing. We also have pending a few substantive bills introduced by Representatives Murkoslow-Powell, Shalala, and Wasserman Schultz that would help alleviate the humanitarian crisis and dial up pressure on Maduro. I hope we're able to move them forward during our next markup. For now, I'm eager to hear from our witnesses to get a fuller picture of the administration's approach to this volatile situation. But first, let me yield to my friend, our ranking minority member, Mr. Michael McCall of Texas, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Nicolas Maduro was handpicked by Hugo Chavez in 2013, it was clear that he would follow in his socialist dictatorship footsteps. Since that time, Maduro's policies, rampant corruption, and violent crackdowns on peaceful political dissent have turned Venezuela into a failed state. Hyperinflation has skyrocketed, food and medicine are scarce, and according to the United Nations, up to 3 million people have fled the country since 2014. Last week, a fuel tanker and 2 shipping containers were placed on a bridge to block the delivery of desperately needed humanitarian aid, as seen on the screen. This act highlights how evil the Maduro regime really is. The current crisis highlights the horrifying impact of socialism. Those who continue to preach or show sympathy do not understand its history and the abject suffering it has caused. Let us be clear. The suffering of the Venezuelan people at the hands of the Maduro regime is not caused only by its ideology. The Maduro regime is full of criminals that oversee a mafia state backed by U.S. adversaries like Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran, and is linked to drug trafficking and other illicit activities. Today, the people of Venezuela have had enough, and over the last month, they have started to take back their country that they love. Inspired by Juan Guaido, leader of the National Assembly and interim president, millions of protesters have rallied in the streets across the country and stood up to the Maduro dictatorship. Bolstered by the leadership of the United States, many nations around the world, including most Latin American and European countries, are standing with him, as the TV monitor shows. I commend the president for recognizing Juan Guaido as a legitimate interim president, for supporting his efforts to call for free and fair elections, and for imposing sanctions that hold the regime responsible for their criminal actions. This week, I will be introducing a resolution. I continue to work with the chairman in a bipartisan manner to condemn the criminal actions of Nicolas Maduro and countries like Cuba, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria for supporting his regime. It also clearly recognizes Juan Guaido as interim president and urges the international community to support the humanitarian and economic assistance for Venezuela. The Venezuelan people need to know that America is on their side, but it should also be known that we do not aim to choose their next leader. We simply want the conditions that would allow the people to choose for themselves. Our role must be a supportive one, but one that stands for universal principles of freedom and democracy. And today's hearing will allow us to discuss how we can play that role to the best of our ability. In January, I was pleased that the President and Secretary Pompeo called on Elliott Abrams to serve as special envoy for Venezuela. As a seasoned diplomat who has served in numerous foreign policy and national security positions, I believe that Mr. Abrams is the right man for the job. And I look forward to hearing his testimony, as well as the testimony of the other experts here today. I believe this is an issue that both parties can come together on, and do what's best for the people of Venezuela to support this noble cause. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Mr. Elliot Abrams is the U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela at the U.S. Department of State. He is currently on leave at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he serves as a Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Abrams served as Assistant Secretary of State in the Reagan administration and as a Senior Director of the National Security Council for Near East and North Africa Affairs until the George W. Bush administration. I love his first name, even though he spells it incorrectly, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say today. Ms. Sandra Oudkirk is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy. Ms. Oudkirk is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. From 2017 to 2018, she served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Threat, Finance, and Sanctions in the Bureau of Economics and Business Affairs. Her previous overseas assignments include consular assignments in Taipei and Embassy Dublin, Deputy Principal Office in Istanbul, and Narcotics Affairs Section Chief in Jamaica. Mr. Steve Olive is Acting Assistant Administration for USAID's Latin America and Caribbean Bureau. Mr. Olive served as the Acting Director of the Foreign Service Center in the Office of Human Capital and Talent Management from 2017 to 2018. Previously, he served as Deputy Mission Director for Somalia, Deputy Mission Director for Haiti, as well as numerous other roles across nearly 2 decades at USAID. We're grateful for your service and your time this morning. Our witness's testimony will be included in the record of this hearing. And now I'd like to recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each. We'll start with Mr. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee.
Mic down.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify on our efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela.
Don't listen to war criminals.
Hold on.
Elliot Abrams supported genocide in Iraq. Elliot Abrams is going to send weapons to Venezuelan right-wing factions to cause a genocide like he did in Guatemala and El Salvador. Join Code Pink and answer coalition. No to Venezuela!
Okay, the chair will remind all persons in the audience that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House and its committees. Mr. Abrams, I apologize. Please continue.
Venezuela is at a crossroads. Over the past month, we've witnessed a massive outpouring of hope and courage and tenacity by the Venezuelan people. We saw it again yesterday as they have taken to the streets to protest a regime that has brought them nothing but poverty and misery and repression. They have placed their hopes in a young, dynamic, and legitimate leader, Juan Guaido, to lead them through a transition to democracy. And we join the Venezuelan people in this effort. Under the Maduro regime, the situation inside Venezuela will only get worse. Venezuela has become the most violent country in the world. Hyperinflation is spiraling out of control and will reach 1,000,000% or more. There's widespread hunger. Communicable diseases that are easily preventable are resurging once again.
May I remind
bloody coup in Venezuela. If you care about humanitarian crises, why don't
the chair will remind all persons in the audience, if we have to clear the hearing of spectators, we'll do it. Okay, I want to again say the chair will remind everyone that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House and its committees. If this continues, we'll have to just clear out the hearing room of people who are here. It's unfortunate, but apparently there are some people who only believe they're the only ones who should be heard. Last time I looked, we were a democracy and everyone has the right to be heard. So please continue, Mr. Abrams.
And oil production has fallen from 3 million barrels a day to about 1 million. Probably will go down to about 500,000 by the end of the year. More than 3.5 million Venezuelans, as you have said, Mr. Chairman and Mr. McCall, have been forced to flee their country and spread throughout the region in search of food and medicine and work and protection. The light in all this darkness is Venezuela's National Assembly, the last democratic institution in Venezuela. Interim President Juan Guaido has provided new hope to those who want to return to a free and democratic Venezuela. Through his efforts, we look forward to a democratic and multi-party transition, an economic recovery that benefits all, and competitive, free, and fair presidential elections truly representative of the will of the people. We have always recognized that the solution to Venezuela's political and economic crisis must be led and achieved by the Venezuelan people. The U.S. government role is to support that effort. And as we meet today, Mr. Chairman, the State Department and its interagency partners are hard at work, responding to Interim President Guaido's call for international humanitarian assistance. We invite international partners to join us in helping to fill warehouses and assistance centers with basic supplies the Venezuelan people so desperately need. We also continue our implementation of over $140 million in existing programming to address the regional humanitarian crisis. As you've said, Maduro and his cronies are conspiring to prevent this life-saving assistance from reaching the Venezuelan people. But of course, those at the top of the regime are well-fed. They impose misery on the Venezuelan people, but they do not share it. The United States has effectively levied individual and sectoral sanctions on the Maduro regime. We have exponentially increased the cost of doing business for the regime in the gold sector, the financial sector, now in the oil sector, the combination of which has created enormous pressure on Maduro and his band of thieves. We've frozen bank accounts. We have revoked visas of those who benefit from their corruption and complicity. And this is not a U.S. effort alone. It's now more than 50 democracies in this hemisphere and around the world. The Venezuelan desire for freedom has galvanized a global effort on behalf of Interim President Guaido. As a result of this growing pressure, there is a storm brewing inside the Maduro regime that will eventually bring it to an end. While it is impossible to predict the moment this will happen, we believe the current political and economic environment is unsustainable and that he will not be able to weather it much longer. For those remaining supporters of the regime, we have one simple message. Your time is up. A new, free, and prosperous Venezuela will rise, and your fellow citizens will remember who stood by them in their struggle. This includes especially the armed forces who will be needed in the future to build a secure Venezuela where law and order defeat criminality and violence. Now is the time for the armed forces to support the Venezuelan people and reclaim their own legitimacy. Over the next weeks and months, we will continue our pressure against Maduro and his inner circle. Last week, I announced visa restrictions and revocations on members of the illegitimate Constituent Assembly. Today, we can add, we have imposed visa restrictions and revoked visas on members of the TSJ, the illegitimate Supreme Court. But we will also provide off-ramps to those who will do what is right for the Venezuelan people. We'll support Venezuela's interim president, the National Assembly, the new government, and its aspirations to create a new Venezuela. We'll continue pressing our humanitarian assistance delivery with the help of regional partners and the international community. And we are hopeful and confident that the Venezuelan people will succeed in their quest for liberty. And when they do achieve this monumental goal, it will show despots and dictators not only in our hemisphere, but in the rest of the world, that the will of the people for freedom will prevail over those who try to suppress it. Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me here today, and thank you for the continuing interest and support that this committee has shown, bipartisan interest, in supporting the struggle for freedom in Venezuela.
You are a convicted criminal. You defied Congress. You lied to Congress in the past. You are guilty of perjury and you're lying again. That bridge was closed for years. where that food was supposed to come by. And when you were in charge,
The chair will remind all persons in the audience that any manifestations of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House and committees. Okay. Ms. Oudkirk.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall.
Can you push the microphone a little closer? Good.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. On January 28th, the United States designated Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA, under Executive Order 13850. This action extends to entities that are majority owned by PDVSA. These new sanctions are intended to place pressure on the illegitimate former Maduro regime, minimize its receipt of revenue from the United States, and safeguard the U.S. financial system. The designation of PDVSA will also preserve Venezuela's national assets for the Venezuelan people. The United States is holding accountable those responsible for Venezuela's tragic decline. As Special Representative Abrams noted, under the former Maduro regime, Venezuelan oil production steadily declined due to mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of investment. PDVSA has long been associated with allegations of corruption and a variety of schemes designed to embezzle billions of dollars for the personal gain of corrupt Venezuelan officials and businessmen. These sanctions aim to prevent the illegitimate Maduro regime and other corrupt actors from further enriching themselves at the expense of the Venezuelan people. Concurrent with this action, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued general licenses that authorize certain transactions and activities with PDVSA to help mitigate unintended consequences on U.S. companies, interests, and allies. These licenses provide equal treatment to U.S. refineries that import Venezuelan crude oil. Any payments made to PDVSA must, however, be made into a blocked interest-bearing account located in the United States. These funds will be preserved for the people of Venezuela. Citgo, a wholly owned U.S. subsidiary of PDVSA, is authorized to continue business operations for the next 6 months. However, this license does not extend to dealings with PDVSA. The license for U.S. companies operating in Venezuela will allow them to continue operations there with minimal exceptions. The oil sector is an integral part of the Venezuelan economy, and its revival will be essential to the country's economic recovery. We have engaged allies, including those in other regions such as Europe and Asia, who have joint ventures with PDVSA in Venezuela on the goals and objectives of these sanctions. We are working to avoid disruptions in vulnerable energy sectors in the Caribbean and Central America, in light of PDVSA's integrated role in those local and regional energy markets. The United States continues to work with oil producers and consumers all over the world to ensure access to reliable and affordable energy supplies. We believe disruptions are unlikely since oil markets are adequately supplied. And U.S. oil producers are a key reason why markets are well supplied. Over the past year, U.S. crude oil production increased by nearly 2 million barrels a day, and exports increased by 1 million barrels a day. This added to market liquidity. U.S. production and exports are poised to continue to grow over the coming months. And so in closing, I'd like to note that we are carefully considering ongoing U.S. involvement in and links with the Venezuelan energy sector as we balance our effort to support the restoration of democracy and the eventual rebuilding of Venezuela. U.S. sanctions need not be permanent. They are intended to change behavior. The path to sanctions relief for PDVSA is through the expeditious transfer of control of the company so that it is no longer a tool for the former Maduro regime's illegitimate uses. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Oudkirk. Mr. Olive.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today on this critical and timely subject. I'm grateful for the committee's longstanding bipartisan support for Latin America and the Caribbean, especially Venezuela. I'm proud of the work that we have done to help Venezuelans and the neighboring communities that are hosting them. Administrator Green and I met some of these Venezuelans who had fled their homeland when we visited Cúcuta, Colombia last July. However, we know that humanitarian assistance alone won't address the root causes driving people away from Venezuela. Lasting political and economic reforms are the only sustainable solutions to this crisis. This is a pivotal moment in the history of Venezuela. The people are standing up against the dictator. They are not alone. As USAID Administrator Mark Green said, and I quote, "We proudly stand with the people of Venezuela who are yearning for freedom and a true democracy," end quote. Venezuelans have endured steady erosion of human rights and fundamental freedoms under the corrupt and repressive Maduro regime. We have seen widespread shortages of essential food and medicine. There have been major outbreaks of diseases like diphtheria, measles, malaria, which have previously been under control or eliminated. On January 23rd, the people peacefully took to the streets to protest against Maduro's regime. The National Assembly, the only legitimate body, has asserted its constitutional authority and put power back in where it belongs, in the hands of the Venezuelan people. The struggle for democracy in Venezuela is led by the Venezuelan people themselves. I am proud that USAID has a long tradition of standing by Venezuelans who have continued to assert their democratic rights. USAID supports local human rights defenders, civil society, independent media, electoral oversight, and the democratically elected National Assembly. Over the past 5 years, we have provided close to $40 million in democracy assistance to these groups, including the planned $15 million in fiscal year 2018 funding, which cleared Congress yesterday. Thank you. I salute the bravery of the Venezuelans who have kept up the fight for democracy, even when their cause seemed nearly impossible. USAID Administrator Mark Green and I have spoken by phone with Interim President Guaido and have met with the Venezuelan ambassadors Vecchio and Borges to coordinate USAID's humanitarian response and support to the National Assembly as they restore democracy and prosperity in Venezuela. Our most immediate priority will be to get food and medicine to those who need it. USAID will always be ready and willing to help vulnerable Venezuelans. When Interim President Guaido requested urgent humanitarian assistance from the United States, Secretary of State Pompeo announced that we are ready to provide an initial humanitarian assistance to the people of Venezuela. USAID has pre-positioned food, nutritional supplements, hygiene kits, and medical supplies in Cúcuta. The U.S. is coordinating with Interim President Guaido and his team of experts, governments in the region, and humanitarian partners on the logistics of deploying aid to mobilize a response that is efficient and safe. Since fiscal year 2017, the United States has provided approximately $140 million, including nearly $97 million in humanitarian assistance and approximately $43 million in development assistance to support affected countries' emergency efforts and build their long-term capacity to host the more than 3 million people who have fled Venezuela. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee, thank you again for this opportunity to testify today. I thank you for your continued bipartisan support and look forward to engaging with you further as the United States helps the people of Venezuela to return to peace, prosperity, democratic, and citizen-responsive governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olive. Let me start the questioning and let me ask Mr. Abrams. As I said in my opening statement, I'm certainly willing to give credit where it is due in terms of elements of the administration's approach to Venezuela, but my biggest concern about the policy is what seems to me is clearly missing, and that's an effort to deal with the 3 million Venezuelans who have fled the country. The administration has pushed countries in the region to open their homes and hearts to Venezuelans, and I certainly support this effort. But how can we call on other countries to admit Venezuelans while continuing to close the doors of our own country to these same individuals? So my question is, will the Trump administration reassess its historically low refugee admission numbers, and will President Trump grant temporary protected status, or TPS, to the many Venezuelans here in the United States who should not be forced to return to Maduro's Venezuela? I would urge you to do so. I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
I can't speak about the broader refugee question. It's just not within my own remit. On the question of Venezuelans in particular, the doors are not closed, certainly for those who have a reasonable fear of persecution and can apply for political asylum. But on the broader question, I think you're raising an important question, and it's one that I intend to discuss with the Secretary when he completes the current trip to Europe, the question of Venezuelans who are in the United States.
I hope we can continue to have dialogue on it, because I think it's really important. The situation, as you have said, with the refugees should really be paramount, or at least up front in terms of things that we're doing and things that we could do to help diffuse this crisis. So I'm going to pursue that, and I hope that we can get some more answers. Let me ask you again, Mr. Abrams, and maybe Ms. Oudkirk can also comment. When it comes to the new sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector, I certainly understand the need to squeeze Maduro, but I hope that the White House has thought through the potential impact that these sanctions could have on the Venezuelan people if Maduro, by some reason, manages to remain in power. So has the administration assessed the humanitarian impact of these sanctions on the Venezuelan people if there's not a quick transaction? Have you considered the impact on U.S. refineries and their employees, which process Venezuelan oil? And can you please share those assessments with us?
Well, on the humanitarian impact, the money that the United States was paying to PDVSA was not going to the Venezuelan people. I mean, if it were, the kind of starvation, the kind of reappearance of communicable diseases would not be taking place. So I don't think the sanctions alone are going to have that impact. But in any event, we want to do a very big humanitarian surge with the many allies we have in this effort to help the Venezuelan people to make sure that their own situation is not worsened.
Okay, I hope that we can continue to have further dialogue on it. Ms. Oudkirk, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. On your question related to the impact on the United States on refineries, we've been looking at that very closely, and we're in very close contact with the 12 Gulf Coast refineries that imported the majority of Venezuelan crude oil that came into the United States. There are a number of license applications pending with OFAC that will provide some specific relief. And we at State are working in concert with our Treasury colleagues to process those as quickly as possible. And we're committed to remaining in contact with U.S. industry as the situation progresses.
All right, thank you very much. I'd now like to call on Mr. McCall, our ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Abrams, I think we really have a historic opportunity to transform what's been a socialist dictatorship that has been a humanitarian crisis into a democracy supported by freedom and the people. And at the same time, I think for the first time in decades, have an influence on Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. And as I look at the Russians in Venezuela and Iran, the Chinese, that worries me about our backyard. But I want to ask you this question. How important is it for the United States Congress to recognize the legitimacy of the interim president, Guaido?
Mr. McCall, I think it'd be very important. I mean, we have 51 countries, including the United States now, that recognize him as the interim legitimate president of Venezuela. I think it would be really valuable for the Congress to join that crowd.
And Mr. Elliott, I will continue to work in that effort. The Chairman, let me ask you about the military. I think, the military, I think the majority of the military supports the people and President Guaido. I think, unfortunately, the ones at the top are, there's corruption, there's narco, terrorism, cartels. How do we get the military to move away from Maduro to support the people and President Guaido?
This is the toughest question. And our answer thus far has been first to pressure them, sanctioning many members of the upper ranks. Secondly, to tell them continually that there are off-ramps if they decide to side with the people of Venezuela. Thus far, obviously, that has not happened, except in a few isolated cases. But we are hearing a lot of discontent in the military. I mean, for one thing, if you're a general and look down at the ranks, you know that your own people in the army are starving. And what about their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers? So we think that this opinion is spreading within the military, that the current situation is untenable. And we hope that there will be a decision on the part of many in the military, first, not to support the Maduro regime, but second, not to block desperately needed humanitarian aid.
And I was impressed by your optimism about the situation, that eventually that will happen. Mr. Raul, on the humanitarian aid issue, we saw the pictures of the roads being blocked off by Maduro, not allowing the humanitarian assistance from the Lima group that agreed to send this down there. We just met with the president of Colombia, and he was talking about this very issue. How can we get that assistance into Venezuela to help these desperate people? And have you thought about possibly using not just land borders, but the sea as well?
Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. We are indeed looking for ways of distributing the assistance safely and effectively within the country. We are in daily communication with Interim President Guaido and his team on finding out what those avenues to do so. We are also committed to pre-positioning goods and supplies in other parts if that's necessary. We also are looking at scenarios of flying things in as the situation permits. But right now, today, the Maduro regime is not allowing access. And we do hope that through the diplomatic efforts we're making and the internal efforts by the interim President Guaido and his team will change that scenario shortly.
Well, and I think as the people of Venezuela see what their, I would say, illegitimate president is doing and what the military is doing to block this humanitarian aid, that they will rise up even more so and hopefully return this country to a democracy. It could be such a great country with such great natural resources. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Mr. Sherman.
Wherever Russia goes, people flee. We have 3 million Syrians who have left their country and nearly the same number of Venezuelans. There's talk here of Venezuela being a socialist country. I would say that various governments in Scandinavia have adopted policies of democratic socialism, and I don't think there's anyone in this room that would call the Maduro regime democratic socialist. We've got a situation where Russia expects to be repaid. Mr. Abrams, what steps are we considering to support an action by the Venezuelan people to say, okay, we owe you so much, minus the $2, $3, $10 trillion of harm you did to our country by supporting this criminal Maduro. Therefore, you only owe us $1 trillion instead of $2 trillion. Mr. Abrams, are we discussing with the Russians how we can make it plain to the permanent future Venezuelan government that they do not have to pay Russia and that they will not suffer any demerits in their credit rating for Western agencies and Western banks?
We've begun to have those discussions. Primarily, of course, it would be led by Treasury, but the interim government, the National Assembly, has said that they would repay debts. Some of those debts, I think, were never approved by the National Assembly. Ultimately, it is a decision that they're going to, most of these, that they're going to have to make.
But have we put the Russians on notice that we would support and require our banks to support a decision by the Venezuelan government to offset that by trillions of dollars of claims against Russia, and that we might choose to prohibit our banks from looking at any credit rating that was impaired by failure to repay Russia?
I don't believe that exact message.
I hope you will. In this room, we were told that Turkey is a great friend of the United States, and therefore we should turn a blind eye to history and not recognize the Armenian genocide. Mr. Abrams, can you work inside the administration so that they have an understanding that Turkey is not a friend of ours here in our own hemisphere, and that accordingly the administration would announce that it would not object to this committee once again, as it has in the past at the committee level, passing the Armenian genocide resolution?
You're going to get me in trouble here with these questions.
That's the job.
That's the idea. The role that Turkey is playing in Venezuela is to give all-out support to the Maduro regime. There are very few countries that are doing that. And Turkey has decided to align itself with Russia, Cuba, in taking that position. And I will certainly take your message back to the department.
Ooh. Are you directly in contact with the Turkish government regarding their policies in Venezuela?
I am not personally.
I hope you would talk to those who are and
Yes.
make it plain that the administration, if you just go neutral on this,
Yep.
Congress will be the conscience of this country. And we also have Venezuela reportedly owe China $20 billion. I know that China's policy toward Maduro is different than that of Russia, but what is China doing now to help the legitimate government of Venezuela?
They aren't doing anything to help Mr.
Are they providing any additional funds to Maduro?
No, my information is that they won't lend any more money because they're worried about getting back what they've already lent. And the message that we've passed to them is, if you continue to back Maduro and the economy of Venezuela descends further, you will never get paid back.
And I would point out that countries repay loans because they fear they won't be able to borrow more because of the credit ratings that come from basically New York. And that there may be times when we need to instruct rating agencies and banks not to regard as a demerit a failure to repay a criminal loan. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our very distinguished witnesses, and it's great to see Elliot Abrams, who has done a tremendous job for decades. Let me just ask first on sex tourism. You know, there's about 3 million people who have become refugees, an undetermined number of are IDPs. Many are along the border of Colombia. We know that the gangs very often turn these women into sex slaves. So my question is, what are we doing to try to combat that? Venezuela has been a tier 3 country for many, many years, including currently, an egregious violator, and that's even before the latest crisis. Secondly, as was pointed out, Mr. Olive, 300,000 children are at risk of death from malnutrition. You underscored the resurgence of once eradicated diseases like diphtheria. And I'm wondering, have vaccinations ceased in Venezuela? I remember in the 1980s, President Duarte in El Salvador had days of tranquility. And I have actually traveled down when, and Elliot remember this very well, when Duarte and the FMLN had days of tranquility to vaccinate the kids because so many were dying from preventable diseases. Would days of tranquility be perhaps a way forward to get these kids vaccinated? Let me also point out that the Foro Penal, the Venezuelan human rights group, said between January 21st and 31st, the number of Venezuelan political prisoners jumped from 273 to 966. How many of those are being tortured? And why hasn't the UN been even more outspoken against this horrific mistreatment of these people, including young people, adolescents? And finally, the Wall Street Journal reported that the government of Juan Guaido has held debt negotiations here in Washington and China with China. What are we a part of that? Are we encouraging it? Not much time, but if you could answer those questions.
Let me just begin on the trafficking in persons. We get no cooperation from the Maduro regime, of course. There are efforts, and Ms. Peralta can talk about that, on the Colombian side of the border to offer not only food, medicine, but some protection as well.
Thank you, Congressman. And that is absolutely correct. On the border areas, especially in Colombia, that is, our funding does help with that issue. It is a very large issue that we cannot control completely, but our programs do address that. In your question about
provide
vaccines,
for the record some elaboration on that and how well the tip office is engaging on this as well?
I'll defer to state for the tip offices, but for our programs that we are providing in Colombia, they include identifying vulnerable people who might be vulnerable for trafficking, working with youth on the issue, et cetera, as part of the programming. Sir, in terms of vaccines, yes, it is true that inside Venezuela, there are vaccines available and therefore less children and other people being vaccinated. We have seen an increase then in these diseases as a result. We are monitoring that carefully in Colombia, again, as part of our assistance. The Colombian medical system is very concerned about being overwhelmed and having these diseases to begin to increase in their country as well. And so that is part of our assistance package. And eventually the assistance package that goes into Venezuela will also include vaccines.
Did you want to comment on the debt issue and whether or not the Chinese negotiations with the...
I wouldn't say that. I don't believe there are any negotiations using that term.
Okay.
Talks narrowly. Discussions, sending of messages have taken place. There have been some reports in the press also about additional talks that the Chinese have denied, and I haven't had a chance to find out whether they have actually taken place.
If you could speak to the use of torture, and is the Convention on Torture and the experts at the UN treaty body looking into this?
Well,
anybody know?
There are many reports of the use of torture in Venezuela, but they have not permitted the various UN special rapporteurs to come in for quite a while. So that's one of the things we would like to see, for the regime to admit the special rapporteur on torture.
Congressman, your committee and Congress has provided us with increasing assistance to Venezuela, and it includes defending victims of human rights and helping them on these issues.
Again, on the trafficking issue, are there any estimates as to how many women or children and/or have been trafficked?
I don't have those. I don't know if the tip office has, and we will find out and come back to you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
We're going to have to end the question. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Democracy is the key for me. And I've got a deep and long history with Venezuela. I don't like the fact that there's no democracy in Saudi Arabia. I don't like the fact that there's no democracy in North Korea. And I speak out about it. And then some of these places, they don't have any elections. I do have confidence in the Venezuelan people. I was been involved in Venezuela when many were not here. I was part of a bipartisan delegation. It was Cass Ballinger from North Carolina, Bill Delahunt from Massachusetts, and myself, who engaged with then President Hugo Chavez. And I saw back then that individuals who were poor, who had never had anything from any other government, never any consideration when I was on the ground to see that they, for the first time, was getting schools and hospitals and getting their fair share and this president, Hugo Chavez, was elected in a free and fair election. I've seen, and because I was there, I witnessed several of these elections when the United States, and this is why the United States cannot lead in this matter. I was there several times for elections, and I watched people line up in a peaceful way and waited for hours to vote and elected Hugo Chavez. I saw recall elections, and Hugo Chavez allowed the democratic process to continue. And he faced those recalled elections and won fair and square. So I then saw that there was an attempted coup in Venezuela in 2002. And as certain CIA evidence has now been revealed, we, the day after the coup, acknowledged the coup government. The people of Venezuela went back in the streets and demanded that their democratically elected president was restored. So the context and the reason why I say that is, it's complicated and difficult for us in the United States to take the lead, when in fact, the Venezuelan people also know that we acknowledge not a democratically elected president, but we tried to undermine them. So for me, democracy is important. And that is why I do, and I am worried about democracy when it's failed. And I've known Nicolas Maduro. We had this group called Grupo de Boston. And I've tried my best to try to bring the both sides, opposition and at that time Chavistas, together. And we had people working collectively. I must admit, under Nicolas Maduro, I've seen the situation continue to deteriorate. And people of Venezuela are suffering. And I've seen him avoid some democratic elections. I've seen the National Assembly get democratically elected. So there is democracy in Venezuela. That's why I recognize the National Assembly. And the National Assembly speaks for me, for the people of Venezuela, which is why our focus should be on having free and fair elections in Venezuela. I'm concerned about the conversations that the president is having with the threat of sending military into Venezuela. What our focus should be is to make sure that we are doing all that we can, supporting the Lima countries, the OAS, and others to have a free and fair election conducted, because the Venezuelan people believe in democracy. And that's why you see the National Assembly now, where the opposition is. And I am continuing to talk with members of the opposition, members of the National Assembly, and members of the military, etc., about working together so that we can have a free and fair election, so that the voices, not of the United States, but of the people of Venezuela, is clearly heard. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of our witnesses for being here today. It's really sad to see one of the greatest countries of our hemisphere, Venezuela, which was one of the wealthiest countries of Latin America. I know that over the years, our families had wonderful associations with Venezuelans that is just so reassuring, and I believe too in the people of Venezuela. And that's why I'm very grateful that the National Assembly has elected President Juan Guaido, and the recognition by 51 countries of his presidency, and this is on behalf of the people of Venezuela. Additionally, I'm very grateful for the United States Agency for International Development, Mr. Olive. People need to know how effective USAID has been around the world, helping persons in relief efforts, and in particular this time, $97 million has already been provided, another $20 million from the State Department. But of course, it's very clear that the aid has been blocked by the Maduro regime. And so what efforts are being made to get around this blockage, Mr. Olive, and what can be done to help get more aid to the people of Venezuela?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. We are on a daily basis with calls with members of the interim government of Guaido's regime, of his presidency, talking about ways we can get aid into the country. There are many scenarios being put forth. We are overturning every stone to see what is possible. There are diplomatic efforts that I'm sure the special representative can also speak to. But you rest assured, daily we are trying to find a way to get this assistance to the people who need it most.
And we're very fortunate again to have 51 countries recognize the Guaido presidency. What efforts are being made internationally, not just USAID, to help the people of Venezuela?
There is a very, pardon me, there is a very broad effort. You will have heard at the Ottawa meeting about a week ago, Canada announced $53 million in additional aid. Each day you find one or another country, mostly in Europe now, announcing another contribution to this effort. So it is an increasingly international effort.
And to reassure the people of Venezuela, what efforts are being made that it indeed gets to the people of Venezuela as opposed to what has occurred in the past of where there's been looting?
Thank you, Congressman. We share that same concern that the delivery of assistance must be done safely, it must be done efficiently, and those provisions need to be in place for us to be effective in delivering assistance to the Venezuelan people.
I would just add that I think that's true of all aid, including UN aid, and we've looked at that too. That is, the regime has used aid. First of all, they've stolen a good deal of it, but they've also directed it to their political supporters. And we are trying to make sure that any path of aid that goes in is not diverted either for corruption or for political purposes.
Well, it just makes a difference for the people, and it's just encouraging to see bipartisan support for this aid. Ms. Oudkirk, it's been reported that the Maduro regime is either transferring or selling the assets to the people of Venezuela, which is their gold reserves. What is the latest on protecting the gold reserves for the people of Venezuela?
I'm sorry, Mr. Congressman. I unfortunately don't work with gold reserves. I can take that question back, though.
And additionally, with that, we have sanctions. And I hope that as you get back with me that we identify who the possible purchasers are and who's facilitating this so that sanctions can be in place. And then, Mr. Abrams, again, thank you for your service for our country. We know that there's drug trafficking significant out of the regime, the Maduro regime, human trafficking. What is being done, and also terrorist harboring of Hezbollah, FARC, and what's being done to identify this and block efforts that threaten American families?
Well, it's very difficult when you have a regime that is, in fact, very much in favor of doing that. ELN, guerrilla group from Colombia, is protected on their side of the border. There's a lot of drug trafficking that benefits the top officials of the regime. What can we do? Well, one thing we can do is sanction those who are involved in this. In some cases, we can prosecute people involved in this and try to assemble the information, because the day will come when Venezuelans will take back control of their own government, their own country, and they'll be able to pursue this.
Thank you. We look forward to a bright future for Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Sires.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this meeting, and thank you to the witnesses that are here today. Ms. Oudkirk, can you talk to me a little bit about the oil sanctions? I know that in light of reports that Juan Guaido plans to name a new board of directors for Citgo. The process will require the U.S. to legally recognize the new board members. What would a new board have access to U.S. banks accounts with proceeds from Venezuela's oil sales that are being blacked by the sanctions?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. So as I noted in my remarks, the key to sanctions relief for PDVSA is the transfer of control of that company away from Maduro and his cronies and to a democratically elected representative of the Venezuelan people. With regards to Citgo operations in the United States are covered by a general license that Treasury issued on the day the sanctions were announced. So Citgo's operations here in the U.S. Are continuing under that license, and that license covers them for 6 months from the date of announcement. The ban is on remitting payments back to PDVSA as long as it is under the illegitimate control. So if you have,
What would a board do named by Guaido? What would that do if he names a new board?
For Citgo,
Yes.
I will have to get back to you on the details of that. I don't have the answer for you right now. I'm sorry.
Mr. Abrams, do you?
Well, we don't want any of the, we don't want any funds to go to the regime. So that would not be permitted. But I think there's a lot of lawyers in Washington who are making a lot of money trying to figure out the answer to your
My daughter's a lawyer. That's not killing the lawyers. Go ahead. Well, you know, my thing is if we are able to get this money in U.S. banks, and obviously under this sanction, could that money be used for humanitarian purposes in Venezuela?
It can. All these funds, all Venezuelan government funds are, in our view, rightly available to the legitimate interim president, Mr. Guaido, and the National Assembly. So they can use those funds to purchase additional humanitarian assistance. Right. There's a lot of procedures to go through to get them actual control of it. And they've made it clear that they want to be extremely careful. They're going to be accused of misusing the funds. So everything's got to be totally transparent. But in principle, yes.
And I know that Maduro is propped up by the Cubans in Venezuela. How many Cubans are really actually in Venezuela propping him up?
Give you a round number. It's the multiple thousand. It's not a few hundred. It's several thousand Cuban officials, including intelligence people.
And getting back to the money, I know that he made an effort to move $1 billion into Uruguay in gold, and Uruguay rejected it. Did you read that article? Did you?
There are continuing efforts, and some of them, I'm sorry to say, look as if they've been successful, in which, a private jet comes in and gold is put on it and off it goes, and then the gold is sold and the money goes to people in the regime.
Now, they're opening an account in Russia. That was the latest that I read. To move the money into Russia
too, because, most Western banks, not just American banks, European banks, won't touch any of this. So they need to go look for things like a Russian bank that will deal with it.
But if we prevent the money from going into Venezuela, where are they getting this money to move to Russia? Can you speak to that?
So I think the point of the sanctions is to do exactly what you just described, to keep the money in these blocked interest-bearing accounts in the United States so that they don't flow back to Venezuela and aren't then, disappeared. So, however, the sanctions were only announced a couple of weeks ago. So money that had gone back before then is available to the illegitimate regime to be used for these purposes. So the point is, from now going forward, keeping that money in the blocked accounts so that it can't be misused.
Thank you very much. My time is up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel being here. As we know, the Maduro disastrous economy has created a food insecurity. Only about 30% of the protein requirements are being met. There's cases of malaria and TB are increasing in a failed state. You see measles, diphtheria, sanitation goes down. So it's a bad situation and it's going to get worse. Yet over the last 10 years, Maduro, and I'm going to, in a spirit of bipartisanship, I'm going to agree with my colleague Gregory Meeks about Chavez in the beginning, because there were some rapid changes that did benefit the people in the lower tiers of the economy. However, that got absconded in his third and fourth term, and then Maduro just lost it. Maduro has taken over $11 billion from the Venezuelan people, and it is the most violent country on the planet today. And you think of all the things going around as far as murders per capita. And then you look at who's supporting Maduro. It's Cuba, Russia, China, Iran, Bolivia, Turkey, certainly not cheerleaders of democracy, or certainly America. And then I look at Cuba, and we've heard numbers over the course of the last few years that Maduro has Cuban security guards around him because he doesn't trust the Venezuelans. We've heard numbers up to 40,000 Cuban soldiers in Venezuela. Are they playing a role of surveillance and intimidation in your experience and the information you have towards the Venezuelan people?
Yes, and toward the Venezuelan security forces, Mr. Yoho. I think you're exactly right that they are the security guards directly around Maduro, and one of their really important roles is to spy on and surveil the security forces, the army, to make sure that everybody shows loyalty to Maduro. He doesn't trust his own people.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, the surveillance. We just heard last week from a very reliable source that China, via ZTE, is offering their facial recognition to the Maduro government so that they can control their people like China is doing. Russia wants that technology. They're going to do it. Iran wants that. And I think we're seeing things played out. History is repeating itself. With a failed state that creates a vacuum, that vacuum will be filled. And so we've got a choice. We can allow Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, people that are anti-democracies, anti-American, fill that void. The people of Latin America, Venezuela in particular, will really suffer, or we can get behind the legitimate interim president, President Guaido, and with us and the 51 nations, as Mr. Wilson talked about, stand behind them, because that's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for the Venezuelan people. Something came up in a question. Do the people of Venezuela have gun ownership rights, or was that taken away by Chavez or Maduro?
I do not know the answer to that. I'll have to find out.
But it's interesting that a socialist country that turns to a dictatorship doesn't have the means to protect themselves. Yet the criminal gangs do, and the counter or the narco terrorists have those, and the military has those.
We do know that the Maduro regime has distributed arms to its gangs.
They have. And I think that again goes to the breakdown of Maduro, because he knows he's not legitimate. And so if we're going to honor legitimate elections, we know that President Guaido is the one that we need to follow. Ms. Oudkirk, you were talking, the question came up about Citco. If the legitimate president gets recognized around the world, President Guaido, that money that Citco is producing, if we were to remove the sanctions or keep the sanctions on, that money can go into escrow, can it? So that we know it doesn't go to Maduro. And when things get sorted out, it'll go back to the rightful owners of the Venezuelan people, right? We can do that, can't we?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, the point of the license, the general license that was provided for Citgo operations was to allow Citgo to continue to operate here in the United States, and for any funds that would have been remitted back to the PDVSA parent in Venezuela to be held in a blocked interest-bearing account here for the future use of the democratically elected representatives of the people.
Thank you. I'm out of time, and I appreciate your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Abrams, you said that there's a coalition of 51 countries joining with us, or we're part of. How many of those countries have said that the use of military force is an option and should be on the table? How many of those other countries have stated that?
I don't know if any have stated it.
I don't either. That's why I asked the question. So we're the only ones that have stated that, had their leaders say that.
We're the only one probably in a position.
Well, no, that's not what I asked. I mean, the other thing is Ambassador Bolton, just a couple of weeks ago, was seen holding a notepad, and it captured 5,000 troops to Colombia. And the president last weekend is again, stating that the use of U.S. military force is an option. And my concern is if we're part of a coalition, we should be working in concert with that, not standing alone, having an option like that on the table. And I think that as you look at our actions in that respect, I think indeed it can backfire on us. I think it plays right into Maduro's rhetoric about the U.S. involvement. And I think it's something that won't help the cause of that. Has President Guaido, has he ever said anything or uttered anything about the use of U.S. military force as an option? Has he said that?
He actually made a comment a few days ago relating to humanitarian.
No, I mean military force I'm talking.
Relating to getting humanitarian assistance in. But this is not the path I think you can see that the United States government is pursuing.
Then why are we saying it though?
Because
that's my question. You know, Section 3 of the War Powers Resolution says the president should be consulting with us. Now, the thing, I think we're doing so many things that could be helpful. We're working in concert with other countries. All those things are good. But the statements, I mean, I don't think it was a mistake, perhaps, that notebook phrase from Ambassador Bolton was captured. And why would he have that on his notebook? Why would that come out? And why would the president be saying this without working in concert with the other countries in the coalition, or without having first a sincere dialogue with Congress on this matter? Doesn't that make your job more difficult?
It hasn't, because we always take the position that all options are on the table.
Well, perhaps that's not a good option right here. I believe strongly that we're hurting our cause.
Well,
and the cause of the Venezuelan
people. The work that we are doing, and we are doing it on the diplomatic front and on the economic front, on the humanitarian front, with lots of other countries. This issue does not get in the way.
Well, I think it plays right into the hands of the dictator that's our adversary right now. And I think it really undercuts the ability and our involvement with the Venezuelan people themselves. Because ultimately, I think we all agree, the resolution, if there's going to be any kind of significant, tangible resolution, will come at the hands of the Venezuelan people themselves to make that.
I agree.
Just a quick question then. Before we recognized President Guaido, was there actions taken to make sure our embassy personnel was secure before that was uttered? Was there actual policy discussion before that was uttered?
Yes. This is a matter of the utmost significance to all of us. To the Secretary, we speak to the Chargé in Caracas literally every day. I talked to him this morning again about the question of security. It is on the minds of everybody in the department, and it was then.
Well, I would suggest too, as the final comment, that it's too late now, but as we go forward, before the administration is talking about the use of military force in this situation, keeping that as an option, that they should have sincere discussions with this committee and with Congress, and then make declarations like that. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for their time and certainly for their service. Mr. Abrams, in keeping with the prior questioning, I can say that in the wake of Maduro's abortive attempt to expel U.S. diplomats, the United States is negotiating with the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry to establish a U.S. interests office, I've been told. Mr. Abrams, can you provide an update on these negotiations and again, what security measures have been taken to keep our diplomats safe?
Well, on the security measures, I wouldn't want to go into that at an open hearing. But the security question is one, again, that's on our minds every day. We are not negotiating an intersection. An intersection is used in a case where there is a government and we do not recognize that government. But in Venezuela, there is a government we do recognize, which is—
So is there a U.S. interest office being stood up or no?
No, there is not.
There is not. All right. I'm amazed at the breadth of the international coalition now calling for change in Venezuela. Principles of sovereignty and non-interference have in the past limited some Latin American countries from speaking out against regional abuses, but Latin America is truly stepping up to the plate and taking a strong stance against their neighbor. Mr. Abrams, what was the tipping point for Latin American states that have called for Maduro to step down, and how is the U.S. working to unify this coalition of hemispheric states to stand against human rights abuses in Venezuela?
I think the tipping point has really been Maduro conduct, the conduct of the government. And when Venezuelans in the National Assembly came together behind interim President Guaido, that I think was the moment when, and I agree with you, it's really quite remarkable to see so many countries in Latin America and also in Europe, which is against their usual practice, you know, to come forward and recognize him. We are in touch with really all of them constantly, as we talk about now. For example, we had the Lima Group meeting, we had a meeting in Ottawa. We have tomorrow a humanitarian assistance meeting hosted by the OAS. So there is a
to that point, Mr. Abrams, and I don't mean to interrupt, but as a follow-up, I know that the Organization of American States has also been uncharacteristically critical of Maduro and refused to recognize Maduro's legitimacy last month. I understand that Venezuela is seeking to leave the OAS, but how can the organization continue to support free and fair democracy in Venezuela? Can the OAS aid the United States and these other coalitions in enforcing sanctions on the Maduro regime?
At some point, there may be a credentials fight in the OAS because until there is, the Maduro regime is the recognized government according to the OAS. We have the same problem in New York with the UN as well. But to the extent that the organization can help, particularly on the humanitarian side, they are trying to do so.
Well, I know OAS last month refused to recognize Maduro's legitimacy. So that is a good development. Venezuela has long-standing ties with Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy and terrorist organization. Mr. Abrams, to what extent does the Maduro regime rely on proceeds from illicit activities supported by groups like Hezbollah and drug trafficking networks for survival? What are we doing to address this? Thank you.
The regime has made a great deal of money over, and higher ups in the regime have made a great deal of money over the last decade in particular, out of things like drug trafficking. It's very hard for us to address when the government in place, of course, is behind all of this and is profiting from it. And the people who ought to be engaged in law enforcement are in fact themselves making money from this. So what do? We sanction them. We cancel visas in some cases. We can try to go after them through criminal prosecutions in some cases, and we have. There are some people in jail in the United States for engagement in Venezuelans, for engagement in drug trafficking, people who are connected to the regime. But the real solution to this is to get a democratic government in place that will fight drug trafficking with us.
I thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. We have all watched in horror as the Maduro regime has destroyed Venezuela's economy, starved its people, and engaged in widespread corruption and repression. We all want a better future for the people of Venezuela and want to end this man-made humanitarian crisis. And we all believe that the Venezuelan people have the right to pick their own leaders, a right Maduro has denied his people by refusing to hold free and fair elections. However, we must be very careful, in my opinion. It is not the job of the United States to choose leaders in other countries. The United States has a long and not altogether positive history of involvement in Latin America, which I believe you are all familiar with. Any transition in Venezuela must be truly democratic and led by the people of Venezuela. The United States must work with the National Assembly and other governments in the region in a supporting role. And I want to turn to my first series of questions because I am concerned by continuing comments from the Trump administration noting that the use of military force is, as the president said, an option. And so for you, Mr. Abrams, my first question is, we have not, of course, Congress of the United States has not declared war on Venezuela, correct?
Correct.
Is there an existing statutory authorization that would allow for a military intervention in Venezuela? Yes or no?
Not to my knowledge.
Has Venezuela attacked the United States, its territories or possessions or its armed forces?
No.
Has the administration increased troop deployments to countries including Colombia, neighboring Venezuela, at any point in the last month?
Don't believe so.
Are there currently any plans to or discussions about moving additional combat troops to Colombia or any other country that neighbors Venezuela?
Not to my knowledge.
Is anyone at the White House, National Security Council, Department of Defense, or any other agency making plans for U.S. military engagement in Venezuela?
That's a question I can't answer. I know of no such planning. But.
Well, consistent with the War Powers Act, I've introduced legislation that expressly prohibits the administration from taking military action in Venezuela without consulting Congress. Will you pledge that the Trump administration will not take any military action regarding Venezuela without consulting with Congress in accordance with the War Powers Act?
I don't know that I can answer that question, Mr. Cicilline. A series of presidents, have taken a jaundiced view, I might say, of the War Powers Act, so I'm really not in a position to speak.
Well, under our Constitution, as you know, only Congress can declare war, and we have neither declared war nor granted the administration the authority to send the armed forces into hostilities in Venezuela. In my view, it would be illegal under U.S. law, inappropriate, and reckless to attempt a military intervention. The United States must show leadership in our own hemisphere, and we must continue to provide aid to suffering Venezuelans. But I want to just build on Mr. Keating's question, because you said of the 51 countries in this coalition, we are the only one that has threatened the use of military force. And in response to a question from Mr. Keating, you said, because we're the only one capable of doing it. Surely you're not suggesting the other 50 countries do not have military capability to engage in a military action if they so elected, do you?
Well, some do and some don't.
So some do, and we're not the only ones that have that ability.
We have not threatened military action in Venezuela.
Mr. Evans, we're not
all options are on the table.
My question is, we're not the only one that has that capability. So when you said that to Mr. Keating, that was not accurate.
We are the only one with the kind of capability, obviously.
Okay. But others have military capability and have not made the same assertion of that being an option. Isn't that correct?
I am actually not sure of the answer to that, of what other governments have said.
Okay. So, Mr. Abrams, what is particularly concerning to me is that in light of the fact there is no legal authority to express the use of military force as an option, it's unclear to me how the president or anyone in the administration can claim it's an option on the table, because it is not. And to the extent that we are suggesting that it is, we are misleading the international community, we're misleading the people in Venezuela. So I urge you to take back the message to the administration that it is not authorized and not helpful. And I'd now like to turn to Mr. Olive to talk a little bit about the politicization of aid. Is it true that historically American humanitarian assistance has been offered on the basis of need alone?
Yes, correct.
And would you say that in order to provide life-saving assistance in war zones and dangerous areas, humanitarians need to be able to operate in a neutral and apolitical way?
Correct.
And do you have, is it true that the United States through USAID is pre-positioning humanitarian aid on the border of Venezuela?
Yes, we are.
Do you have any concerns that tying humanitarian assistance to a particular political outcome could have unintended consequences or harm our ability to deliver assistance in Venezuela or to other countries? And what steps is the administration taking to ensure that aid does not become a flashpoint?
Administrator Green has said, we will always, as a U.S. government, be ready to help those in need. There are people in need in our hemisphere right now as a result of this crisis, and we are preparing. We already are supporting them in these border areas. We are doing what we can to build the capacity in country to receive and distribute aid securely and efficiently and be able to monitor those distributions, and that is our focus.
Thank you. Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three of you for being here today. Mr. Abrams, I'm very glad you're here. I agree with our ranking member that you're exactly the right person for the job.
Thank you.
I've always believed that it's ill-advised, if not self-defeating, to broadcast to ruthless dictators what the United States is willing or unwilling to do. That it's a mistake to tell someone like Maduro that we're willing to use a manual screwdriver but never a power drill. And that, in fact, we shouldn't remove any tools from the toolbox. My question, Mr. Abrams, is does the War Powers Act require that the President of the United States get permission from Congress to even speak about using military force?
I don't believe so.
I didn't think so. And is it not true that military action is always an option unless presidential action triggers the War Powers Act and the Congress says no?
Well, I think that's correct.
That's what I thought. Thank you very much. I yield back.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to continue asking questions in the same line as my colleagues, Mr. Keating and Mr. Cicilline. I think, and I don't want any of this to be construed as, I think what the Chavez regime and the Maduro regime have done to Venezuela is an absolute disaster, and the humanitarian crisis that they've created is a disaster, and we have to do everything to support the people of Venezuela. But our framers, by their genius and design, created separation of powers, keeping the nation's purse and sword separate. Congress is empowered to declare war, provide for and regulate the armed forces. The president, as commander-in-chief, has the responsibility to direct the armed forces as they conduct the hostilities. We've been talking a little bit about the War Powers Resolution. It is absolutely very clear. It provides the president to introduce U.S. armed services into situations of hostilities or imminent hostilities as exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territory or possessions, or its armed forces. Mr. Abrams, my colleagues have already pressed you a little bit on the use of military force in Venezuela. I'd like to ask you a yes or no question. Do you agree with the War Powers Resolution which states, quote, the president in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities or into a situation where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and after every such introduction shall consult regularly with the Congress of the United States Armed Forces until they are no longer engaged in hostilities or have been removed from such situations? Yes, no?
I can't give a yes or no answer to that. I mean, this is a long debate, as you know better than I. Presidents, including the most recent president, President Obama, have used force in cases where there was a big debate about the War Powers Act. And presidents have sometimes said, I'm submitting a report, but I'm not sure that I'm obliged to do so. I just can't get into that debate today. I'm not prepared to do so.
Well, again, I think the War Powers Act is very clear in when the president is authorized to introduce U.S. forces. Mr. Olive, I'm going to shift to you. And as I mentioned prior to the hearing, I also do publicly want to acknowledge the men and women that serve this country every day, from our State Department, our diplomats, our aid and development folks. We're proud of them, and I think we can't acknowledge their work and contribution and patriotism to our country enough. Can you give me a quick assessment of how bad the humanitarian crisis in country is at this juncture, and how much worse it's gotten over the past few weeks?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your kind words to my colleagues. I will definitely take that message back to them.
Thank you.
The situation is deteriorating on a daily basis. The reports that we have gotten from inside the country are hospitals are drastically reducing their supplies and not able to have surgical equipment, vaccines, et cetera, available to even do routine types of surgeries, let alone more complicated ones. We are very concerned about the power grid. There are numerous power outages throughout the country that, of course, affect then hospitals and clinics, et cetera. The food is available, but it's controlled by the regime and used as a tool. And that is something that's deteriorating the country as well. So people are having trouble getting food. We are hearing of increasing amounts of malnutrition amongst infants and being able to get the nutrients that they need at those early stages of life. So yes, our reports are pretty steady that this is a decline on a daily basis.
Well, thank you. In my limited time, Mr. Abrams, given this deterioration and the circumstances on the ground, and given the unique situation where the Venezuelan military really does have a lot of power in terms of which direction things go, have you seen a shift in open sources that suggests the military is now moving away from Maduro or support for Maduro is changing?
I think we've seen some indications of that. It's probably a subject better discussed in a closed hearing.
Great.
Thank you.
And I'll yield back.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to everybody who came in today to testify. And Mr. Abrams, as a veteran of the Iraq War, I just want to thank you for everything that you did in service of the country. Thank you. Over the past several months, we've witnessed the brave people of Venezuela rise up against the despot and dictator, Nicolas Maduro. Since Maduro's rise to power in 2013, Venezuela has been plagued with poverty, death, and misery. The regime's authoritarian rule and socialist policies have led to over 3 million Venezuelans fleeing the country, 90% of the population living below the poverty line, and 300,000 children at risk of starvation. It's one of the most violent countries in the world, rampant with murder. And hyperinflation is expected to reach 10 million% by the end of 2019. Venezuela is in the midst of an extreme humanitarian crisis that must be addressed immediately. Mr. Abrams, how have the socialist economic policies of the Maduro regime led to Venezuela's collapse?
I would say there's a combination of mismanagement, corruption, and policy. For example, what has happened with PDVSA? Instead of treating it as a private company, what they've done is basically looted it and put all sorts of regime supporters in there. There's no state of law in Venezuela, so that private property, in a sense, really doesn't exist. If the regime doesn't want you to have private property, they'll just take it away from you. So it's been a disastrous downward spiral.
What are the core functions of the Maduro relationship with Cuba, Russia, and China?
Well, I think in the case of China and Russia, they've gotten a lot of money. That's enormous loans, tens of billions of dollars. Cuba's different. Obviously, they don't have any money to give. What they give is people, largely intelligence and military people, to surround this regime and act as a kind of loyalist core. As Venezuelans become more and more disillusioned with this regime, Maduro surrounds himself with Cubans who he trusts more than his own people.
Do you see a situation arising where the United States would become involved militarily in Venezuela? And if you do see that, how do you foresee that scenario playing out?
I do not see it. I do not see it. And one of the things that's sort of notable about the discussion about the use of force is that is not the policy of the United States. The policy is to pursue humanitarian, economic, diplomatic paths forward to try to support the Venezuelan people's desire for democracy. When we say all options are on the table, that's because all options are always on the table. That's not the preferred route, and that is not the route we're going down.
Thank you, Mr. Abrams. Mr. Olive, what is the best way for the U.S. to support Venezuela's democratic opposition? Is the United States ready to assist the organization with free and fair elections?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question, and absolutely. Your body has provided now $15 million in fiscal year 2018, and a portion of that can go to ensure that an electoral process is fair and transparent, and we will work alongside our state colleagues on whatever assistance may be needed, but it will have to be requested, and as the special representative said, Venezuelan-led.
If we do have a future democratic government in Venezuela, are we ready to engage in assisting the new free nations, such as nation building?
We are looking at different scenarios. We will, again, it's got to be Venezuelan-led. They will determine their priorities. They're part of our hemisphere. We stand ready to assist. But the most important thing is to get the government and the power back in the hands of the Venezuelan people.
Thank you, Mr. Olive. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. I have in the past supported sanctions against the Maduro regime because, as Mr. Meeks mentioned, I do believe in many ways that Mr. Maduro has oppressed his people. At the same time, I believe that the role of the United States is to promote democracy, freedom, and human rights around the world. The role of the United States is not to handpick the next leader of Venezuela. And Mr. Abrams, I have a question for you. My question is whether you're aware of any transfers of weapons or defense equipment by the United States government to groups in Venezuela opposed to Nicolas Maduro since you were appointed special representative for Venezuela.
No.
And I want to be respectful of you, but also honest. The reason that I asked that question, there's been a McClatchy news report of such an incident. Are you aware of that news report?
Saw the report, yes.
I asked this question because you have a record of such actions. In Nicaragua, you were involved in the effort to covertly provide lethal aid to the Contras against the will of Congress. You ultimately pled guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress in regard to your testimony during the Iran-Contra scandal. So I ask you the question, can we trust your testimony today?
Well, you can make that decision for yourself, Mr. Castro. I can tell you that the answer to your question is no. It's a simple and unequivocal no. There's been no such transfer of arms.
I also want to ask you, I mentioned the promotion of democracy and the fact that the Venezuelan people have to pick their own leader. What is the administration's strategy for encouraging elections as soon as possible in Venezuela?
Well, that is the heart of really of administration policy. That is, after the Maduro regime, a short transition to an election. And that's the view of all of the 51 nations that are supporting Mr. Guaido. I completely agree with the way you started. It's not for us to choose the next president of Venezuela. It's for Venezuelans. We can help, as a lot of other countries can help, in facilitating a free election because there's a lot of experience. The National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, Freedom House, and equivalents in a lot of other countries are really quite good at giving assistance.
Also, I know that you've spoken about the fact that, or you mentioned that all options are on the table. And in a private setting, we had a conversation about that, which I won't get into. But I want to reiterate one point, and one of the reasons that I disagree with that approach. The reason that I disagree with the statement and the approach is because I believe that it gives license to countries like China and Russia to then further engage with Venezuela and do it in the name of protecting Venezuela's sovereignty by drumming up the idea that the United States is going to invade the nation of Venezuela. I strategically think that it was a bad statement. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will remind all persons in the audience that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House and its committees. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the good thing and the bad thing about being a freshman is all the good questions already get asked, but I still have a couple that haven't been asked. I think it's been established that Cuba, the Cuban regime is in line with Maduro. How would you recommend that we could separate that?
I don't think that lectures to the Cubans are going to have much impact. I think, in fact, that is going to happen when there is a freely elected democratic government, and Venezuela will just send them home.
I agree with you. Thank you. Could y'all follow up just a little bit more detail on the Russian influence in Venezuela and what you would recommend that the United States would do to limit that influence? We talk a lot about sanctions and all that, but I mean, honestly, that's sort of like, my mama saying, I'm going to tell your dad, and then dad would say, I'm going to tell your mama, and then, kids, they shriek in horror, but in reality, they just go off and giggle a little bit.
Well, there have been some conversations with the Russians, and I'm sure there will be more, but I can't say they've done any good thus far. Again, it's partly a matter of just seeing Venezuela move to a freely elected democratic government, which can then make independent decisions about the relationships it wants to have. For example, when sanctions come off, they will not need to turn to Russia to say, how do we deal with these sanctions through Rosneft or through Russian banks or anything like that. The Russians, I think, at this point are not putting any more money into Venezuela because they're worried about getting paid back for the money they've already put in. And once there is a freely elected government that can deal again with the World Bank and the IMF and a broad international program of support, I think the Russian role will diminish very quickly.
And Mr. Congressman, if I can add on to that, if we look at Russian involvement in the hydrocarbon sector, so one of the reasons why this administration made a decision to license the continued involvement of U.S. companies.
Right. Can I ask you a question? I already know what hydrocarbons means, but Mr. Pence doesn't. Could you explain that to him?
Oil and gas.
Okay, thank you.
And so one of the reasons why we licensed the continued involvement of U.S. companies in upstream oil production in Venezuela was because the oil and gas sector is the key pillar of the Venezuelan economy, and it will be going forward. And keeping the U.S. corporate presence there with their best practices, with their adherence to all the sorts of practices that we expect here in the United States is, we believe, one of the best ways to ensure that in the future, Venezuela is able to return to prosperity and sort of an economy that functions normally.
Where we've seen that they've nationalized these industries, we've seen the prices, in fact, spiral upwards. Is that correct? Not artificially, but legitimately.
Well, it depends really, but I think what we're focused on here, we're looking at an oil sector that is in profound crisis, and the general economic crisis in Venezuela exacerbates that. The trained staff are voting with their feet; they're going to other countries. Key equipment is being stripped of copper wire, so electricity can't be transmitted. So it is all knitted together, but we do believe that Western involvement in the upstream oil sector will leave us positioned to have both the U.S. private sector and the U.S. government assist with eventual economic recovery. And we are a counterweight to the Russian and the Chinese investment, which is otherwise very prevalent in that industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Trump seems averse to international cooperation and multilateral agreements. He seems to prefer go it alone, shoot from the hip, mano a mano type of diplomacy, such as it exists. But some of us believe that if we're going to be successful in helping Venezuela survive and recover, through political means, not military means, and through humanitarian assistance, we're going to need to work with the Lima Group and with OAS. So I would ask you, Mr. Abrams, don't you think that your role on the National Security Council and the George W. Bush administration during the 2002 Carmona coup in Venezuela hurts your credibility with Latin American countries and makes it difficult, if not impossible, for you to serve now as a special representative of Venezuela to foster these kind of agreements?
Excuse me, the gentlewoman will suspend.
No.
Chair will remind all persons in the audience that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of the proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House and its committees. So I please ask the audience to cooperate, or else we'll have to have people removed, which I would not like to do. Go ahead.
My answer is no.
And you don't think that your appointment sends the wrong message to our allies in Latin America?
Well, I've been in contact with an awful lot of them. I've talked to a lot of people on the phone in the last couple of weeks. I've met with a bunch of foreign ministers in the last couple of weeks. These have been very good meetings, and we are all cooperating because we all want the same thing in Venezuela, which is democracy.
Well, I hope so too, but I think your no is puts you in the minority. I'll go from there to a broader question. What happens if Maduro is ousted? Will he then go to Russia or to Cuba, or will we have a truth commission? Will he be imprisoned? What about these corrupt oligarchs we've heard about? What about the heads of the military? And what's going to be the U.S.'s position at that point? Would some of you comment on that?
Well, I'd say first, these are for the most part Venezuelan decisions. They're decisions that a new democratic government is going to have to make. The decision on where Maduro goes is for Maduro. Does he want to go to Cuba or Russia or someplace else? But you know, there have been a lot of democratic transitions in the world, happily, in the last few decades. Each one is a different case. They have to make these decisions internally about how much do they want to do in prosecuting people? Do they want to have amnesties? And you know, the National Assembly has already passed an amnesty bill. These are not our decisions. We're not Venezuelans.
I appreciate that, but we often hear about some subversive activity that encourages one kind of approach or another, and I suspect that would be the case again, too. Comment about what we do after the fact, once Maduro goes?
Yeah, from a development standpoint, we are prepared to help the new government in its priorities of rebuilding the country. USAID's assistance is very public. We will use our normal mechanisms that we have done in other countries, and we will be transparent and happy to share any information that we have when we reach that day where we're having plans and we have responded to a request from the government.
We've heard a lot about the security folks from Cuba. What about the teachers and the doctors that came from Cuba to Venezuela? Will we be able to work with them after the fact?
My guess would be that many of them will be withdrawn. They're sent there in large part as a political message of solidarity with Maduro. So after Maduro, again, that's a decision for the Venezuelans to make, not for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Mr. Pence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all the witnesses today, thank you for your time. As a Marine, I'm proud when America plays a leadership role with our allies and partners in support of democratic principles and the rights of free people in Venezuela and around the world. As Americans, there is no higher calling in our diplomatic endeavors than to stand with free people against tyranny. I want to focus on how United States leadership has helped build a coalition of support for the Venezuelan people. Over 40 countries have now recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela, a number that has effectively doubled in recent weeks. I am proud that the United States was among the first to stand alongside interim President Guaido and the Venezuelan people. I also believe that it is important to provide support to Venezuelans' neighbors like Colombia, who are generously hosting millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country and the crisis. Mr. Olive and Mr. Abrams. Mr. Abrams, you stated more than 3 million Venezuelans, more than 10% of Venezuelans' population, has been forced to flee their country to survive. You also mentioned today in your testimony, and I quote, "Maduro cannot weather much longer." My question is, how concerned are you about the effects of this on neighboring countries, and what are the implications of this on the larger region?
Well, I can begin the answer. There is a steady outflow. That 3 million, or it may even be 3.6 million, grows every day. And if the regime stays in power throughout this year, it can reach 5 million. So we will be hearing a lot more from Brazil and Peru, and especially Colombia, about the need for help in dealing with continuing massive outflows of Venezuelans. This will stop only if there is a democratic turn in Venezuela and a beginning of economic recovery.
Congressman Pence, thank you for your question. We have been in constant contact, especially with the Colombian government, on these issues and is supportive of them. Administrator Green is meeting with President Duque tomorrow to have this very conversation. Of one part of it will be, how can we continue to assist Colombians deal with the amount of Venezuelans migrating into Colombia at this time? We are concerned about it and are prepared to go shoulder to shoulder with Colombians.
Is there any concern that the blockade is going to attract even more people faster with the humanitarian supplies sitting across the border?
I think it is a concern, and it's one of the reasons why we all want to get the aid in. Venezuelans need it very, very badly.
When Administrator Green and I were there in July, it was clear that they were saying, and we saw it firsthand, that 90% of the Venezuelans that were coming into Colombia to get support were going back into Venezuela. So they were just coming in to be able to get the vaccines or healthcare or food or generate some income to be able to go back into the country. And we expect that to continue until when we are allowed to bring in our humanitarian assistance into the country in a safe and efficient manner, in a manner that we can monitor where it goes and that it makes sure that it gets to the people who are in need of it most.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm proud that President Trump and Secretary Pompeo continue to speak with clarity and provide the leadership our values require on the situation in Venezuela. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we can say today that probably all, if not most, of the members of this committee are really concerned with the violence in Venezuela, the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela affecting thousands of families that has led to an unprecedented migration of Venezuelans throughout the region. And of course, the presence of Hezbollah there as well. I myself have co-sponsored legislation to address that particular problem. But Mr. Abrams, many of our allies have expressed concern of your appointment to deal with this problem. Some have characterized it as being perhaps like appointing Exxon to lead a discussion on the Green New Deal, or maybe even appointing MBS to lead a discussion on fairness in journalism and accessibility to journalism. Do you feel that your past actions in Iran-Contra have permanently impaired your ability to fairly and transparently deal in the region, since we all know the outcome of what happened then? Do you feel that that's a major problem, baggage that you bring to the table?
I don't, and I've been doing this job for 2 whole weeks. And I can tell you that members of Congress have raised it. No Latin American of any nationality with whom I have dealt has raised it. We've had lots and lots of discussions about how we're going to promote democracy in Venezuela. I guess I should say, since I've been attacked now 3 times in my own defense, if you look at the Reagan record of 8 years, when we came in, There were military dictatorships
Mr. Abrams,
all
that's not an
over
attack. That's a
Latin
fact of
America.
history.
And when we left, in country after country after country, there had been transitions that we supported. Chile is a very good example. So I think it's actually a record of promoting democracy, and I think a lot of Latins know
Respectfully,
that.
I differ with you. I think it's a fact of history. We should not dig our heads in the sand and make believe that this never happened, because it did. And you were at the helm of that. And
I was at the helm of promoting democracy in Latin America.
You may want
I
to
do that.
characterize it that way, but I don't. I think you were involved in the Iran contract deal, and I think that permanently damages you to be a fair and impartial arbiter in a conflict that's leading to humanitarian crisis of unprecedented levels in Venezuela. So I want to get to my next question, which is, do you believe that there could be a peaceful diplomatic solution to this crisis? And if so, has our nation engaged the Vatican, the United Nations, Mexico, and Uruguay in their efforts to resolve this peacefully without any bloodshed?
Well, we've had discussions with the Vatican, with the UN. I spoke to the Secretary General actually yesterday morning. Mexico and Uruguay are somewhat different because they have a different approach to this, which is the kind of dialogue with Maduro that has been tried and failed in past years, tried by the Venezuelans who are pushing for democracy in their own country.
And the opposition has, in some instances, asked to be armed. Do you feel that that's a viable way for protecting themselves, or do you feel that arming the opposition will lead to a civil war?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think that the question of security for well, it's not really the opposition. It's now, in our view, the legitimate government of Venezuela and the National Assembly. Security for them, security for individuals like interim President Guaido is a real issue. But the solution to it is replacing this government with the interim government and then allowing the people of Venezuela to choose their government.
Finally, do you feel that there are currently any individuals in the armed forces or in government that are applicable to receive Magnitsky Act levels of sanctions and
Yes,
action?
I think there are.
And are you willing to share those?
Not in a public hearing. I think we need to go over the names again, but certainly some of the people rise to that level of human rights violations.
Mr. Chairman, let me just again reiterate my concern for a potential human crisis emerging in the region, potential civil war, famine, if we don't go the diplomatic way and abandon our old bad ways of Iran-Contra.
Thank you, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Abrams, you in your written testimony, you talk about that Cuba has provided direct support for the Maduro repressive tactics, including the recent deployment of its most feared units, the Black Wasp. Can you kind of expand upon this military unit and what they're doing in the country of Venezuela?
We've seen Maduro reinforcing his Cuban Guard Corps. Again, it is a lack of confidence in his own people, or it's a knowledge that his own people want him gone. So there are Cubans surrounding him. That's the Palace Guard. This special forces unit has now come in. This is in the last few weeks. And I think it's really quite striking that he does not trust the Venezuelan people or the Venezuelan armed forces.
And so the Cubans have sent special forces units into Venezuela to prop up this regime.
That is correct.
And then since January the 23rd, we have seen a host of nations join us in our ability to affect change in the nation of Venezuela. I see one of the nations that has yet to take a position one way or the other, and you touched on it very briefly a moment ago, was Mexico. And again, can you kind of talk about why they have failed to take a position one way or another on this particular important matter?
They are quite isolated in Latin America, you're right. When you look at the other larger democracies, I think I'd say it's just ideology. It's an old view on the part of their president that this is all about American interventionism. And when we say, well, it isn't, you've got 51 countries, including most of the major democracies in Latin America, plus Canada, saying this isn't about the United States and Venezuela. We have not been able to persuade them, at least to this point.
And you also talk about in your written testimony that Maduro and his cronies are conspiring to prevent life-saving assistance from reaching the people of Venezuela. Can you expand on that just briefly as well?
Yes, well, perhaps Mr. Olive could do so as well. But what we're seeing visibly in the blocking of that bridge is a policy on the part of the Maduro regime. And Maduro himself has said, we don't need humanitarian assistance. He's completely blind to the suffering of the Venezuelan people.
And you also talked about in your written testimony that they've also canceled gasoline shipments so that you would be unable to transport humanitarian aid. Is that correct?
You want to comment on that? I have not seen that exact report.
We have not seen it as a major concern now. If we have full access to being able to get things into the country, we will overcome that, whatever fuel shortages there may be.
And so we currently have for lack of better terms, a dictator who is refusing humanitarian aid in a country of great crisis and has also aligned himself with the Cuban government to the point that there are Cuban special forces currently in Venezuela at this time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here and thank you for your testimonies. Mr. Adams, in 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question. That was not a question. That was I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
That was not a question. Thank you for your participation. On February 8th, 1982, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about U.S. policy in El Salvador. In that hearing, you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which more than 800 civilians, including children as young as 2 years old, were brutally murdered by U.S. trained troops. During that massacre, some of those troops bragged about raping a 12-year-old girl before they killed them. Girls before they killed them. You later said that the U.S. policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement. Yes or no, do you still think so?
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and I
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Whether you, under your watch, a genocide will take place and you will look the other way because American interests were being upheld is a fair question, because the American people want to know that anytime we engage a country, that we think about what our actions could be and how we believe our values are being furthered. That is my question. Will you make sure that human rights are not violated and that we uphold international and human rights?
I suppose there is a question in there, and the answer is that the entire thrust of American policy in Venezuela is to support the Venezuelan people's effort to restore democracy to their country. That's our policy.
I don't think anybody disputes that. The question I had for you is that does the interest of the United States include protecting human rights and include protecting people against genocide?
That is always the position of the United States.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Abrams. Sir, it's well known that members of the Maduro regime have ties to drug trafficking. Now we're hearing allegations of ties with terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah and FARC. Can you walk me through the nature of those ties and what kind of concern that poses to the U.S. security?
Well, some of this, I guess, we should do in a closed hearing, but the group that stands out most is the ELN, the Colombian terrorist group that is harbored in Venezuela. They haven't just escaped into Venezuela. I mean, that's government policy on the part of the Maduro regime. They also have, obviously, extremely close ties to Cuba. There's a Hezbollah presence all over Latin America, and I believe they're engaged in fundraising in Venezuela, and the regime does nothing to prevent that. So these are security concerns that are going to exist as long as this group is in power.
Thank you. Is there concerns about the safety and security of U.S. diplomats and contractors? And do you know of any steps being taken to assure that they're safe?
Well, there are a lot of Americans in Venezuela. The number of official Americans is small, but there are a lot of American citizens who live there. Unfortunately, we have very limited ability to protect them. We do supply some consular services. Every couple of days, we may give out an emergency passport to an American, but the staff size is limited and our ability to protect people is limited. And so we rely on the regime, actually, which controls the guns, to make sure that no harm comes to Americans. And we've made it clear that that is their responsibility under international law.
Thank you, Mr. Abrams. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for coming today. First, I have a question. I'd like to follow up on the chairman's questions about temporary protected status, where we began. Mr. Abrams, do you think it's fair to call the humanitarian situation in Venezuela dire, given the Venezuelan people's need for basics like nutritious food and medical supplies?
Yes.
I understand, as you mentioned to him, that you're discussing designating Venezuela for PTS with others in the administration, given that dire situation. While you were Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs a generation ago, we might say, you testified at a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee that concerned TPS for Salvadorans. At that hearing, you testified, and I quote, "Some groups argue that illegal aliens who are sent back to El Salvador there meet persecution and often death. Obviously, we do not believe these claims, or we would not deport these people," end quote. Is that correct?
I take your word for it. It's been a while.
Yeah, I understand. That was at a hearing before the Subcommittee on Immigration, Refugees, and International Law of the Committee on a bill numbered H.R. 4477, temporary suspension of deportation of certain aliens on April 12, 1984. And is it correct that when you testified at that hearing in 1984, death squads controlled by the Salvadoran government, which had the backing of the United States, were committing horrific acts of violence against the Salvadoran people? Yeah, I don't have a lot of time. Were they or were they not, sir?
The death squads were certainly active, although I cannot remember the exact years, but the amount of death squad activity came down under President Duarte and under American pressure.
Well, just to remind you, as the Atlantic pointed out, more than 75,000 Salvadorans were killed in the fighting, most of them victims of the military and its death squads, more than 75,000. Peasants were shot en masse, often while trying to flee. Students and union leaders had their thumbs tied behind their backs before being shot in the head, their bodies left on roadsides as a warning to others. I would just ask, sir, you of all people, to use your offices to try to help promote TPS for Venezuelans in need. Mr. Olive, let me ask you a question. I'm the son of a official of USAID, so I also appreciate the work of you and your colleagues there. It's my understanding that sanctions on the Venezuelan state-owned oil company that the Trump administration imposed last month are meant to cut off Maduro's cash flow and force his exit. What I want to know is, what is the administration's plan if this approach doesn't work? The Wall Street Journal reported last month, quote, if the standoff endures, the U.S. move could prove devastating for Venezuela's economy, which relies on oil exports for 95% of its hard currency income, end quote, which obviously isn't a great thing. But my question to you is, what does the Trump administration plan to do if these new sanctions squeeze the Venezuelan economy, but Maduro remains? Have you examined what will happen to the Venezuelan people?
First, Congressman, thank you for your kind words to my colleagues. I will take that back to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Most of this is, I would defer to the State Department, but from a humanitarian assistance point of view, we do see many of these resources that were coming into the Maduro regime were not getting to the people. And the ones that were used as a tool, such as their CLAP program, et cetera. We do expect the situation to get worse, and that's why we're pre-positioning goods right now on the border, ready to go into Venezuela, and we are prepared to do much more when we have access where we can securely and efficiently monitor its distribution. And that's what we're prepared to do. For the remainder of your question, I'll defer to the State Department.
No, I agree with that.
All right. Well, we're very concerned about deepening the crisis while we're trying to prevent. Let me finally, Mr. Chairman, just end by I noted, and I really appreciate the bipartisanship here. A number of our friends on the other side of the aisle have called Venezuela the most violent country in the world and the most dangerous country in the world. Things like this. I don't understand that. If you look at Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Mali, Somalia, Yemen, South Sudan, I just hope that we stick to the facts here. The situation is bad enough as it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize Steve Chavit from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olive, what's the state of press freedoms in Venezuela, and how are we countering the regime's propaganda and ensuring that Venezuelans are aware of the support that the U.S. And the international community are providing?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. We are providing support for independent media. We are now up to, with the approval of the congressional notification that is now expired, and we can now use our 2018 funding. We've spent about approximately $40 million or available for. One of the areas is independent media. The groups that we are working with, Freedom House, the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and others are working to preserve an independent media within the country. They are very challenged. They have been threatened, and some have been arrested, et cetera. Some of their operations have been disruptive. Administrator Green, on 2 occasions, one in Washington in December, one in July in Miami, met with Venezuelan diasporas who raised this issue. And he said, we are a lifeline to many of those independent journalists and media, and we will do everything we can to remain so.
Thank you very much. And my final question would be for Mr. Abrams as well as Ms. Oudkirk. What role do energy and oil continue to play in the Maduro regime's ability to maintain the loyalty of countries in the region? And Mr. Abrams, I'll begin with you.
I think it's very important. I mean, the only real asset that they've got is money that comes from oil sales and the oil itself. We've seen that most in the Caribbean, where they have been involved in an awful lot of activities that have produced a political result. And you can see that actually in some of the OAS votes, where unfortunately some democracies in the Caribbean have not joined this group of 51 countries around the world in supporting interim President Guaido.
Thank you very much. Ms. Oudkirk, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, Congressman Chabot. The PetroCaribe program, which is I think what you're referring to, has largely wound down with the exception of sort of concessional oil sales or oil deliveries to Cuba. However, as Special Representative Abrams noted, there are a variety of countries in the Caribbean and Central America who have a large sort of debt overhang with PDVSA. And this is really a problem. The coercive use of energy sales, whether we see it here in the Western Hemisphere or, farther afield, is a real challenge. And I think the key here is that as the sanctions bite on PDVSA, their ability to use to take the oil proceeds themselves and use them directly as money is going to be largely cut off. The United States used to, prior to the sanctions, import about 40% of Venezuela's oil exports. But we paid about 75% of oil receipts because so much of the other oil went for debt for oil swaps with China and Russia. So cutting off that financial flow is really a key focus of the sanctions. And then separately, really working with these vulnerable economies and jurisdictions close to Venezuela to figure out a way for them to extricate themselves from a dependence on PDVSA is a crucial piece of work that we have in front of us going forward.
Thank you very much. In interest of members making votes, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot. We will now recess. Votes have been called. Well, I will urge all the members to please come back after the 3 votes that we have. Thank you very much. Just feel a little patient.
What a sham.
Mr. Abrams, what about all the poor indigenous people in Guatemala? What about the death squad that you supported all of them? I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's really sickening.
To order. Mr. Malinowski.
There we go. My voice carries, but that's better. Let me just start out by saying that in my view, what we are dealing with here is an anti-democratic coup, a slow motion anti-democratic coup that was carried out by the Maduro regime, a regime that packed its Supreme Court with loyalists, that tried to render null and void a Congress that was elected by the vast majority of the Venezuelan people, that imprisoned and tortured Venezuelan citizens who exercised their human right to protest against these outrages, that prevented the opposition from fielding a candidate against the leader of this regime. If this is not a left or right issue, this is not an issue that should divide us on ideological grounds. If any of us in the United States, whether we are liberal or conservative, progressive, whatever, experienced that in our country, we would be on the streets screaming about it, just as the vast majority of Venezuelans are doing. And because of that, I'm a critic of much of the administration's foreign policy, as you guys will not be surprised to hear, but I feel like in the case of Venezuela, this is a policy that, broadly speaking, I can support, and I certainly pray for its success, given what has been happening to the Venezuelan people. I know a number of the issues have been raised already, but with that foundation, I do want to ask Mr. Abrams a handful of questions that relate Venezuela to our overall approach to the world. I think you know, Mr. Abrams, based on your work over many, many years, that the one argument that dictators like Maduro and Putin and others throw at us all of the time when we try to do the right thing, as I think we're trying to do here, is that we are inconsistent, that we aim our democracy and human rights policies at our adversaries or at our ideological adversaries, not our friends. Sometimes that's an unfair charge, sometimes it's more fair, but I wonder if, as a general matter, you would agree that we need to strive where possible for moral consistency.
I do agree. I think it's impossible to achieve in the end for any administration, because
strive for.
We are balancing so many American interests, but it is something worth striving for.
Would you then agree as a general matter, and I know I'm sensitive to the fact you're here representing the administration's Venezuela policies, you can't necessarily speak for everything else, but as a general matter, would you agree that if we are going to be condemning a president who is trying to attain absolute power for life, contrary to constitutions and the democratic process in Venezuela, that we should do so in other countries such as Egypt when that similar situations arise, as a general matter?
I really should not respond beyond the question of Venezuela. It's really not my remit at the department and not while I'm up here. You and I go back a ways, and you know that my view is generally that the United States should be supporting the expansion of democracy all over the world.
Thank you. Would you agree that if we're going to be condemning socialism and its effects on the people of Venezuela, that we should be condemning even more strongly communism in North Korea, rather than talking about how the economy of that country might be about to explode
I think
in a positive direction?
The human rights record in North Korea is pretty well known, but I really, in this hearing, can't go very far down that path.
Okay.
It's not my responsibility.
And would you agree that if we're going to be asking countries to help the millions of Venezuelans who are fleeing their country to take in refugees for the time period necessary to give them protection, that we as a country should also maintain our tradition of keeping our doors open to refugees fleeing persecution around the world, as a general matter?
As a general matter, yes. And Venezuelans who feel that they would be endangered by going home should apply for and are eligible for asylum here.
Thank you. Again, I would note that our refugee numbers have made it difficult to meet the demand from Venezuelans and from people fleeing repression and war all over the world. Thank you so much, Mr. Abrams.
Thank you. Congressman Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to first thank Secretary Abrams for coming here and speaking so candidly and clearly and bringing the great depth and length of his experience in Central America and South America to bear on our problems that we face together. The question I have is one that apparently wasn't asked earlier, is about the political transition and that Maduro is threatening to hold these early elections, and how big a threat would they be to the legitimate National Assembly's continuing efforts to institutionalize itself?
They would be a threat. I think as we saw last year in the May 2018 elections, any elections that Maduro runs are not going to be credible elections. There needs to be a free and fair presidential election in Venezuela, but it's not going to happen if it's under Maduro's control.
Thank you.
I have a question. The continued outflow of Venezuelans outside of Venezuela, how much of a destabilizing factor would that have in the region if it continues at the rate that it's going now? Was it 5,000 a day going into?
It's about 5,000 a day net leaving. It will place an even larger burden on the countries that are already feeling this, and Colombia, of course, most of all. Peru has about 700,000 Venezuelans, I believe. So the impact on their health system, for example, is very great now, and you're increasing this by potentially by about 60%. Perhaps Mr. Olive would add a comment.
Yeah, we're very concerned about that. Administrator Green is meeting with President Duque of Colombia tomorrow, and that is going to be one of the topics discussed. The Colombians have expressed a great interest that their medical systems, schools, and social services are being overwhelmed, not just in the border area, but throughout the country, and are concerned that if they cannot continue to provide those services to their citizens, that it will disable or destabilize the country potentially. And that goes for Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Tobago as well.
In a meeting earlier that we had with the President Duque, he said that they already have 400 cases of measles that they have been able to track.
Mr. Patterson, you can call on Ms. Murphy-Powell, and then we can call on the other Democrats when they get here.
At this time, I'd like to ask Congresswoman Muscatset-Powell from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this hearing today. And Mr. Elliott, Abrams, Sandra Outkirk, thank you for being here today, and thank you, sir, for coming. This is an extremely important issue for me personally. I am the first South American representative ever to be elected to Congress, so I bring that perspective to these discussions. I have visited that country many times. I have very close friends that have had to fled this oppressive narco regime, which is what we all call it. And I have some family members that are still in Venezuela. So it's something that I've been very outspoken about for many years. And this has been escalating for the past 15 years. And I am glad that we are now finally having these conversations. And I just hope that this is the beginning of several others that we will have so that we can do everything in our power from the United States to help the people of Venezuela. So my first question, one of the things that I've been focusing on is humanitarian aid. So that's why I've been working on this humanitarian aid bill. And I wanted to ask Mr. Abrams How much has actually been delivered in the humanitarian aid that we have seen that you started with the first 20 million? Do you have details on how much has actually already been delivered?
I'm going to, if you permit, turn to Mr. Olive.
Of that new 20 million that the Secretary Pompeo announced, we have used that money to pre-position goods currently in Colombia, and we're also looking at other neighboring countries and other parts of Colombia, and that's how we've spent it so far. In terms of getting goods in the country, we have not been able to do much. With the money that comes to our Latin American and Caribbean Bureau, which was 9 million in 2017 and will be 15 million with 2018 funds, we have built the capacity of civil society organizations and tested their ability to distribute humanitarian assistance, but it's very small. The security of those partners is very much of a concern of ours, so we've had to keep it a more low profile at this point. And then the only other assistance that's getting into the country is what Administrator Green and I saw when we were there in Cúcuta in July, and that's the Venezuelans crossing over the border, getting the medical services or vaccines or food or things that they need in Colombia and then going back in. But that's all we've been able to do so far. We really need Maduro to allow this assistance that we're building up on the border into the country and distributed correctly.
And are we working very closely with the United Nations and some of their members in providing this aid?
Yes, we are in constant conversation with them. At the moment, they have some restrictions as well, which I think Special Representative Abrams can go into, but we are having those discussions and being transparent on what our plans are.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask you, Mr. Abrams, Cuba, as we've discussed before, has clearly been a major contributor to Maduro's illegitimate regime, and they've been providing support on a number of fronts, including military personnel. And I would like to get a little bit more detail on what you can tell us about the Cuban officers that are on the ground in Venezuela at this time, and also why haven't we sanctioned these people who are helping prop up Maduro and his illegitimate regime?
Well, there were thousands of Cuban, let's call them security and intelligence people on the ground. They form a kind of palace guard around Maduro. As I noted before, what it suggests is he does not trust Venezuelans. He does not trust the Venezuelan military. So he brings in Cubans to surround him and provide security. They also spy on members of the Venezuelan military. They also police the Venezuelan military. So that's what he uses them for, because he sees, I think, his own support among all Venezuelans, including in the military, crumbling. Now, sanctioning them, many of them are, if you will, just security officers in the ranks whose identities we don't even know. We've sanctioned high-level people in the Maduro regime. We continue to do that, civilian and military, and we will continue to do that. We've announced some expansions this week for the Constituent Assembly and the Supreme Court, the TSJ.
Okay. I'm running out of time, but I have one very important question. One of the discussions that I've heard from some colleagues here on the floor is that they're concerned that the sanctions that we're imposing to PDVSA are going to hurt the Venezuelan people. And I want to make it very clear that I'm in full support of these sanctions to PDVSA. But I wanted to ask, what's the administration's plan should these sanctions begin to affect and indeed exacerbate the humanitarian crisis for the people that are living right now in the country?
Let me just say, this horrendous humanitarian situation in Venezuela that we've all been talking about existed 2 weeks ago before there were sanctions on PDVSA. So they have not used those billions of dollars in income to help the Venezuelan people to buy food, to buy medicine for them. In that sense, we know that this funding stream is not, that we have tried to cut off, doesn't go to the Venezuelan people.
And Congresswoman, that's exactly why when interim President Guaido called Administrator Green, his number one, even though he realized that he may need future assistance on electoral processes, civil society and independent journalism, et cetera, he said the number one need is humanitarian assistance, and he asked that it be pre-positioned and ready to get in the country. We don't have that access yet, but we work daily on trying to get that.
Thank you so much. That's why my
Congresswoman
focus has
Shalala.
been the humanitarian aid. Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to participate as well. And I want to add that I absolutely support the other members of the South Florida delegation. It's a huge issue for us in South Florida. And I hope you hear in our voices bipartisan support for most of what you're doing. I have a quick question to follow up on the humanitarian aid, and that is aid to Colombia, because so many of the Venezuelans have gone over the border and possibly to Brazil, but I think Colombia in particular is feeling the need for humanitarian aid.
Yes, the U.S. government has provided $140 million for neighboring countries, and in particular Colombia, of which $97 million of that is U.S. aid has administered. Administrator Green is meeting tomorrow with President Duque of Colombia to talk precisely of recalibrating where we are. What support have we been able to provide? What more is needed? And have those kinds of discussions, because those impacts have been severe on neighboring countries, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Trinidad, Tobago.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Abrams, I'm going to keep asking you the same question about TPS, and I want to reinforce what my colleagues, for those of us in your testimony, you talked about how more than 10% of Venezuelans' population has been forced to flee their country. As you know, many of them have come to South Florida, to Debbie's district, to my district, to Mario Diaz-Balard's district, to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's district. And we are very concerned, and I want to reiterate to the administration, we've introduced bipartisan legislation to extend TPS to Venezuelans. I'm well aware that the administration is trying to take away TPS designations for so many people in my community, and I want to be supportive of them, but also to emphasize adding TPS for Venezuelans.
Well, thank you. This is obviously a very important question. It's one I have discussed with Secretary Pompeo, and I will take it back and let him know of your views.
Thank you. I yield back.
Congresswoman Spanberger.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses who are today. We have highlighted our collective throughout the hearing today. We have highlighted our collective and serious concerns about the use of military force.
Thank you. My apologies. My colleagues have highlighted our collective and serious concerns about the use of military force, potential use of U.S. military force in Venezuela. And even in hearing cautioned, we've heard Admiral Stavridis talk about limited and well-intentioned intervention for humanitarian purposes, saying that a military response would foment rage in the region and internationally. I'm in complete agreement that a military solution, particularly on the part of the U.S., is not an answer, but I do have a couple questions about what we might anticipate from other countries. To your knowledge, are there any other countries who are contemplating direct involvement, such as Russia or China? We have seen Russia come to the aid of autocratic leaders elsewhere in the world. Do you see any indication that Moscow may consider something similar, deployment of advisors or military forces to Venezuela? And I'll open that up to all of the witnesses.
We did see some Russian bombers, if I recall correctly, fly to Venezuela, which was a Russian display of, I don't know, support for the regime, I guess you would say. But they have not put armed personnel on the ground the way they have in some other countries.
And Russia has been known to at times use hybrid warfare and transnational criminal organizations to further some of their objectives and obscure their direct role in doing so. Do we have any indication that this may be happening in Venezuela, or any concerns that it may happen on the horizon?
Well, it's always a concern, and they have an investment in this regime. literally in financial terms, but obviously in political terms as well, and they've been defending it. They made a very strident appearance in the Security Council, for example, on January 25th, when Secretary Pompeo was there. A lot of Cold War rhetoric, really. But it's a very interesting question as to how far they would actually go. And we ask ourselves that question all the time.
Any additional? Okay. And then another question on the same line of questioning. To your knowledge, what is the role of the colectivos or the armed civilian militias? Are they receiving, to your knowledge, any external support, training, or weapons? And if so, do you know where that's coming from, or how the U.S. and our partners in the region might be able to prevent such support and use of such support?
I'm not aware of foreign support for the colectivos. It's clear that they work for the regime, and the regime in some cases has armed them, and they're a kind of auxiliary to the normal, legitimate, if you will, security forces. But the regime has the means, unfortunately, to organize and arm them. I have not seen evidence of relationship between the colectivos and foreign powers.
And for Ms. Oudkirk, I have a question about the sanctions and potential impact of the sanctions. We're well aware of the fact that for many years, Venezuela has been able to invest heavily and in some cases buy the loyalty of Caribbean states through the sale of its crude oil. And some of these Petro-Caribe states have supported actions of the Organization of the American States to put diplomatic pressure on Maduro, which has now led to him threatening economic retaliation. With concerns of the potential for destabilization or humanitarian crises in other parts of Latin America, my question is, do you expect any economic reverberations from Venezuela? And what is the administration doing to reduce the risk of economic damage potentially to these countries, many of whom, like Jamaica, for example, have also borrowed heavily from Venezuela in the past?
Thank you very much for your question, Congresswoman Spanberger. So one of the things that we did to mitigate ancillary consequences on neighboring jurisdictions was OFAC issued General License 11, which gave a 60-day period to wind down U.S. person involvement in third country interactions with PDVSA. So this was designed to sort of smooth out the removal from the transaction chain of U.S. persons, so both individuals and companies. And we are looking on a sort of country by country, jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis at the involvement of PDVSA in these various basically small countries and islands, and figuring out what it is that needs to be done during that 60-day period to ensure that the focus of the sanctions impact remains on PDVSA, not on these small markets.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses for being here and for your patience, and the members who attended today's hearing. With that, the hearing is adjourned.
Democracy, right? They had elections. They wanted to have elections in December. They changed it for opposition to May, and then they wouldn't participate. And we call it fraudulent. Shame on you. Shame. And Colombia is now part of NATO. That's pretty dangerous, isn't it?